today, what I mean by radical incrementalism is tied to a developer-driven urbanism, whereby when one developer gets a good idea, they develop a particular typology. Let's call it, let's say, for example, office condominiums. That's the newest, what they call, product on the market. So they speak about urbanism as if they're making new cars. Office condominiums are the idea that you build an office building, but you subdivide it like condominiums, and the people who own those spaces own them for offices, not for homes. So it's nothing particularly radical in terms of the way that architects think, but to a developer, what they all do is they watch very carefully to see how a new product on the market that a developer pioneers does on the marketplace. And the minute that they see that it succeeds, they all want to copy it. And so what you in effect get is really a kind of form of incrementalism, whereby a period of time follows where there's a very rapid propagation of a successful business plan or business strategy to capture the market that somebody has identified. And I believe that therein lies an opportunity for architects to capture a novelty architecturally. And the incrementalism really has to do with the idea that that propagation starts beginning to generate character within cities that is incrementalist, but with a different set of operating parameters than in traditional cities. Where in traditional cities, people may have just been building in mud because that's all they could build with. That's the reason that, and they couldn't build very large things at a time. Here, the idea is that there's an incrementalism, but the increments are perhaps bigger, but they're still built in increments, meaning you might be building 20-unit live-work complexes. And there's a logical size or a logic to the size of the increment that's dictated by the political economy of the city, meaning that it doesn't make sense for developers to build anything less than that because it takes too long to get through the city for such a small project, but it doesn't make any more sense to build bigger than that because it's too hard to find properties that are large enough. And so it's a little bit of a Darwinian kind of process where it seeks its own, it's like a form of looking for a business. Developers are like, they're like sharks looking for business opportunities. And they're very, very savvy at finding places, kind of holes in the marketplace that can be filled. And once they find one, it's actually a form of creativity, actually. For them to do this. Other developers who are less creative then follow in their wake to copy the same technique. Dana has called it, venture capital versus vulture capital. There's some who are the ones who are the innovators, and then there's some who are basically feed off of the innovators and make their money, and they can many times make as much money, if not more, the second group of people who come around once the one person has kind of done the innovation. So the radical incrementalism is really another, I'm not sure that it's necessarily tied specifically to mixed use, although mixed use happens to be one of the most popular forms of radical incrementalism, meaning that the new typologies that are being developed, these new models that are being replicated, many of them turn out to be mixed use. I think the problem with planners, in my mind, is that planners are always trying to manage the way that cities look through regulation rather than through innovation. And architects are working from the other end, trying to manage or determine what cities could look like through innovation. So it's about what we call, using a carrot versus using a stick. I think I'm always more interested, and perhaps in Sweden this would be of interest, is that I believe that ultimately it's much more fruitful to use the carrot than the stick to provide incentives for the city to grow and to innovate rather than to set limits out of fear of what the worst is that could happen, which is really fundamental. I think that new urbanists are very very limit oriented, very stick advocates. And this term you've probably heard called form-based zoning, which is it's ironically an innovation of new urbanists, but its innovation is in its limit setting, meaning it's a new form of putting limits on innovation, on what architects can do, as a more ironclad guarantee that nothing bad will happen. Because they've tried to limit it through use, they've tried to limit it through style, they've tried to limit it through setbacks and so on, and somehow still bad things are created. And so ultimately the belief is, I think falsely, that by tightening and tightening and tightening those limits, you ultimately can produce goodness. And I think that ultimately all it produces is mediocrity. So instead, what I very strongly advocate for in terms of mixed use is actually, you know, the development of new typologies of mixed use, which can be tested as successes or failures in the marketplace, and then incentives can then be written in from a planning standpoint to encourage or to allow those things to happen. So what Dana and I are trying to do at City Lab is to work with a process called spot zoning, which is an idea where a planning department, because planning departments planners are very risk averse, they're afraid of risk. That's what they do is manage risk. If you have the need to try something new, to test it, but you're afraid of opening the gates to everybody doing something that you're not sure is a good idea, then you use a technique called spot zoning, which means that you make a pilot project where you change the zoning laws on just one property, and you you have a good architect, and you know the planning department is involved, and a developer, and you try out that new typology just on that one location in a community that would be amenable to it. And then if it works, not only can you then change the rest of the zoning to allow for it, but rather than, and this is the part about radical incrementalism that's so important, is that then rather than simply having policy that permits something that you would like to have happen, and hope for the best, you actually have a model project that the developers see and say, wow, that worked. I want to do that too. But simply permitting something to happen doesn't mean the developer will do it, because it still involves a risk for them to do a risky project if nobody else has done it before, even if planners have allowed for it to happen. So there's a very big difference. It's like the difference between theory and practice. The theory or the policy means nothing unless there's a case study, a trial project that actually enables one to understand, to see what happens once it's done and it's placed in the context of the city. And I think that